and welcome to a bonus episode of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty, and today we're not talking travel at all. But one of my regular co-hosts on the podcast, the Sarah Enigma, is joining me today because it is Chronic Illness Awareness Month. And as many of you know, we've talked about it a number of times on the show. Sarah deals with chronic illness. Also, my wife, Courtney, deals with chronic illness. So I thought it would be really important to take a day and not talk about theme parks and actually talk about chronic illness, try to make the world a better place like we do every once in a while. And Sarah, first of all, I want you to tell everybody about your project, your business, Sava Wellness, and what you are trying to do with your experience dealing with chronic illness and how you are trying to help others get through those initial stages.
Yeah, thanks. I started a business called Sava Wellness, and for me, it's a way to let people know that they're not alone. When I was going through my journey, it was very hard to not have anybody to talk to. So, Sava Wellness is a wellness business where you can book in appointments with me, and I can talk to you about anything from not knowing what your diagnosis means to I don't know how to keep track of all my medications, how to advocate for yourself, or just to have someone who's gone through it and knows what's going on to talk to. And then the awareness piece of my business, I'm going to talk with businesses and they can hire me for speaking engagements to just talk about what chronic illness and disabilities are and how to make the world a better and more inclusive place for people with invisible disabilities.
That is so important. I'm so impressed with what you have been doing and what you have already accomplished in the first few months of this business. But I want to talk about that advocating statement that you made because I think that is a big part of this. Recently, I've seen a tweet going around the internet that people have been sharing that says, young adults, I want you to realize like you can leave. And that means if you're at a doctor's appointment and the doctor, for whatever reason, is not clicking with you, you can just stand up and walk out of that appointment. Now, that's not necessarily advocating for that, saying that's the best course of action. But what that is saying is when you're in a doctor's appointment, when it's just not clicking, you can take control of those situations. You can advocate for yourself. I know my wife, Courtney, as I mentioned earlier, deals with chronic illness. It took her a long time to get used to that. And it took you a long time to get used to that. So, why don't you talk a little bit about advocating for yourself and how you learned to do it when you were basically just self taught?
Yeah, advocating is really hard to learn, I think, especially because as we've all been taught, doctors' knowledge is gold. So when they say something, that's what it's supposed to be, right? So it's really hard to then be like, well, that's not right, or I'm sure I have this symptom. That can't be true, or can you just please do this test? I'm sure it's this. And that is very hard to do. And I think for me, I learned particularly out of just frustration and knowing that I wasn't getting the care that I needed. And I knew that if I could just find someone who believed me, I would get the care I needed. So advocacy is not only, yeah, standing up and leaving, it's researching your symptoms, not not to the point where everything, you look up anything, it says you have cancer. That's not what I mean. Like going on Mayo Clinic, looking at the UK has some great NHS resources that you can also look at. So researching kind of what your symptoms are and going in prepared, but also researching different doctors because, like you said, there are lots of doctors out there. It does get hard when you get more specialized because there might be the only one doctor in your area. But then advocating for yourself can be more like, no, I don't want to do that treatment. Yes, I do want this test. Can you please look at this for me? So it is standing up for yourself, and it does take courage and practice. There's still some times where I get out of the appointment and I go, oh man, I really want to ask about this. Or, oh, she made me really upset and I just shut down. And sometimes that still happens to me, but it's a learning process, and the more you do it, the easier it does get. And I do find too that to have someone come along with you, or to at least be in your corner all the time, like helping you research, driving you to appointments, or even coming in an appointment with you, can be very helpful. Because if you have some chronic diseases like I do that causes brain fog, it can be very difficult to advocate for yourself on bad days because you just can't think about it. So, advocating for yourself is also knowing your boundaries and your limits and taking steps like bringing someone along with you so that they're not an impedance. Yeah.
So I know a lot of times when I talk about your chronic illness, whether it be on the podcast or when I'm just trying to, describe you to one of my other friends or something like that, I say Sarah is dealing with chronic illness. Is that the right terminology? Like, I find I'm learning a lot from Courtney going through this and becoming friends with you over the last 2 years. I'm trying to find ways to say, like, I don't want to say you're suffering with chronic illness or, you have chronic illness. I don't want to define you by it, but I want to acknowledge that it is something there. So, what are some pieces of terminology that you use to describe yourself as somebody who has chronic illness that would make it easier to have these conversations?
Yeah. So I think my first piece of advice would be when you have someone with chronic illness or disabilities, just ask them. Ask them what terms they like to use the best. But for example, I don't mind being called a person with chronic illness, chronically ill, a person with disabilities, disabled. I often use invisibly disabled, or I have invisible disabilities as well. So for me, it's quite flexible. I really don't mind. And I don't, even if someone says, oh, you have chronic illness, or I say, I have chronic illness, I still don't define myself by that. But it's just sometimes easier for me to remember than to say a person with disabilities or chronic illness. But really, I've had people from all over the place say, oh, I don't like being called disabled. Oh, I don't like being called chronically ill. Or they really don't like putting that first. So to put a person with chronic illness is very important. And some people like to just say, I have insert disease instead of chronically ill as well. So really ask the person. For me, I'm pretty flexible with what I like to use.
And that sort of leads right into my next question. Do you have a diagnosis for your symptoms? And I already know this one, and I'm asking for our listeners. So I do know it. It's a pretty extensive list. But if you just want to share what makes you comfortable, like that's perfectly fine.
I have Lyme disease and lots of its co-infections, including Babesia, Bartonella, Epstein-Barr virus. And because Lyme disease attacks your immune system, I also now have quite a number, like you said, of chronic illnesses that go with it. And one of the main ones is chronic fatigue.
So I've talked about this a few times as well, that I was very late in my life compared to other people, diagnosis being on the autism spectrum. And it ended up completely changing my life because so many things that I didn't understand or times that I dealt with misdiagnoses or something like that, all of a sudden, now I can actually work on myself because I know what's happening. Did you find that when you would start to get more accurate diagnoses yourself, that really helped you move from one stage of struggling to maybe a stage of surviving?
Yeah, mine was very interesting because it was very multi-layered. Lyme disease can really hide, and in I live in Canada, and in Canada, it's sometimes very hard to detect Lyme disease. If you don't get the test within 2 weeks of being bitten by the tick or whatever is carrying the Lyme disease, the test will come back negative. And unfortunately, 30% of people who have Lyme disease don't get the bullseye rash. I did not get the bullseye rash, so no one knew what was going on. So when I got tested, they said, no, you don't have Lyme disease. And that was 9 years ago. And then I had to fight to find a doctor that would help me with the symptoms that weren't apparently Lyme disease. And because it was treated, because it was untreated for so long, I kept getting more diagnoses and more chronic illnesses. And so every time I got a diagnosis, it was kind of like peeling back a layer. Like I'd get relief for a little bit and I'd be like, oh, thank goodness I have this. And then I get sick again and be like, well, why am I still not better? So we go deeper and deeper and deeper until finally we had to send my blood work to Germany. And Germany is the Lyme disease specialist in blood work in the world. And they finally diagnosed I had Lyme disease. Now, that has been helpful for me, and we've been able to do some courses of treatment. However, because it took about, I would say, 5 years to finally get that diagnosis, I now have chronic Lyme disease, and there's nothing that can be really done because antibiotics won't work anymore. I tried them, they did not work. So I think, yes, it definitely helps to have a direction when you have a diagnosis. I just wish that, and part of my business is to bring advocacy, is that patients can be believed more. Like my mom was the one that told my doctor to get tested for Lyme disease. My mom was right 9 years ago. It just, the test didn't show it. So I think if we just believe people more and do the tests they need, we can get better care, and diagnoses will be even more relieving for the patients because there actually will be a direction and not necessarily a cure, but maybe a better reduction of symptoms.
And one of my favorite things about the way you handle your chronic illness is that you are very, very open. And I know that that is something that people need when they're in this situation. They need to feel that they can be open. They need to have somebody, maybe you don't want to tell your friends when you don't know what's going on. You don't want to tell them yet because you don't know what's happening. So having somebody who's sort of been there and knows what it's like to deal with this. Courtney goes to the doctor a lot and comes back to me frustrated because she's not getting the help that she needs. She's trying to advocate for herself, and maybe the doctor thinks it's this and she's like, but I know it's not this, or whatever the hip diagnosis is that month. They're always trying to label everything as that. And I think that if I didn't know you and I didn't have that background of knowing that this is normal, I could see thinking that what Courtney was telling me, she wasn't necessarily being, I mean, I don't think my wife's lying to me or anything, but it would seem to me like she was being difficult. Whereas a person who's just dealing with these things for the first time, when you're telling your family, they might think you're being difficult. They might think you're the one who's not accepting whatever diagnosis the doctor is trying to give you. So having somebody like you who can say, no, this is very common. A lot of times people have to push through this, I think can be a big benefit to people. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think so. I really struggled without having support that I could talk to besides my family. I had great support in my family, but it's always nice to talk to someone outside it who's gone through it. And I definitely found too that being younger and having all these diseases that you shouldn't have when you're younger is very hard as well because I go to a support group and it'd be all people over 60. And it was like, oh, like we're in totally different life stages. Like it would be so nice to talk to someone who understands. And I think what you were saying about the doctors and telling your family too, what's so hard is chronic diseases, they're so complex. They don't just like you don't just bump your arm and get a bruise and it goes away. It's like your Lyme disease attacks your brain, it attacks your nervous system, it attacks your joints, right? So if you have nervous system symptoms that day, maybe they think you have some sort of I've been told that I had an anxiety disorder. And I was like, no, but that doesn't account for the joint pain as well, right? So I think the fluctuating symptomology of chronic illnesses can make it really hard to talk to doctors and families as well, because your family members could be like, or friends could be like, but you didn't have that symptom 3 days ago. And you're like, yeah, I know, but now I have it today. And it still means that yeah, maybe I don't have arthritis because of the joint pain. Maybe I do have Lyme disease because now I have neurological symptoms. So it can be very hard that way if doctors don't look at your whole body and your whole symptomology. You can really get pushed into something that doesn't describe everything or your fluctuations. And it's the fluctuations that are so frustrating.
We talk a lot about the theme parks. That's what we do most of the time when I have you on the channel. And I think one of the things that was hard for me when dealing with my wife, Courtney, having chronic illness is a little different than, say, how having a friend like you who has chronic illness. I've known you the entire time that we've had our friendship as somebody with chronic illness.
Mhm.
With my wife, Courtney, I've known her before she was diagnosed with chronic illness, before she was dealing with some of these problems. So I'm used to a Courtney who can do more things. I'm used to Courtney being able to show up to the theme park at rope drop and stay until fireworks. And now she can't do that. And I think that's a hard thing for me, not that I don't have compassion or empathy for her, but you've already seen somebody be able to do something. And it's hard to always think, no, she really can't today. Or maybe she can do it on Tuesday, but she can't do it on Saturday. And that's something that me being your friend has helped me sort of understand those things with Courtney. But how would you say that was for people who knew you before the Lyme disease, that they saw you? I mean, you were a great student, you were on your way to becoming a doctor, and you basically succeeded at everything you tried. I mean, I joked the other day when you were talking with some of my friends, like you were a high school basketball player, like, and now you have these different limitations. How do you sort of explain those things to the people who were in your life beforehand?
Mhm. I think the main thing is that there's a lot of grieving involved for yourself as a person with the chronic illness. You grieve the future you thought you were going to have, you grieve the body you used to have or wish you had. And that comes and goes. Sometimes you're like all grieving, you do fine, and other days it smacks you in the face. And I think your very close family members and friends also have to go through that process to be like, oh yeah, like we used to hike in the mountains and now we can't anymore. And I think I was very lucky with my family because I've talked a little bit about it before, but my mom is also disabled and she kind of had the same thing. She was very active, very full of life, and one day she was out and she's had disabilities for probably 15 years, over 15 years now. So for my family, it was very easy for them. Like still hard because it's hard when your family member's struggling. But it was very easy when I started calling myself disabled. They're both like, "Yep." So my mom and my sister are very We're all very connected that way, but I know that I have a very unique support system because of that. Sadly, most people, like I experienced, is you lose a lot of friends. You truly do. I don't have any friends from high school or university anymore. And that's just, it's not because hopefully I'm unlikable or anything. It's just because when they continue to ask you to do things and you continue to have to say no, or I can't do that anymore, it's, they just disappear. Or if you ask, or if you're too honest with them, which I struggle with because I like being honest with people. If you're honest every day that you're having a bad day, people just stop asking and they just ghost you, right? So that's very hard. So with chronic illness, when you're later in life, you really do find out who your true friends and support system really are. And those are the people that you can sit down with and be like, look, this is what I have. These are my symptoms. If you want more information, you can look at this article on the Mayo Clinic, or you can ask me any questions you want. I think as someone asking someone with chronic illness or disabilities, you need to balance asking questions and also doing your own research because sometimes it can be overwhelming to describe the same thing over and over and over again. It really depends on the person. But I think as a family member or friend, you just need to be patient. You need to be really patient and there for them while they're figuring stuff out. Because, like we already talked about, it can be years until you figure out what's going on. And some days you can barely get out of bed, and some days you can go for a walk around the mall. So you just have to be patient, meet them where they're at, and yeah, do some own grieving yourself. To think about how they were before and how they're not going to be now, and how you can still fit them into your life and you into theirs and still have a meaningful connection. I think it takes some soul searching on both parties, but it really can work. Like we've been friends all through this and it you can have great friendships and great support. It just sometimes means asking different questions or asking questions like can I help you? And truly meaning it. That is a huge thing. If you can ask something about, can I help you with something? Truly mean it when they say, oh, can you come do my laundry? Be ready to go do their laundry for them, right? Like, yeah, I don't know if that kind of answered your question, but I think it does take a lot of grieving and just accepting people where they're at.
So somebody just getting a fresh diagnosis and they're starting to deal with some of these things, and you've gone through it and we've talked about it in our personal lives before, some of the things that really really hurt when that happened. So somebody who's now going through them for the first time, you sort of have that firsthand experience because you are going to end up finding people who are going to fit you into their lives.
Mhm.
You're going to find people who will make time, who don't have to go to the bar every night to hang out. I mean, that's probably something where you are in a unique position because you were dealing with this in your 20s when friendships are not as deep and are maybe more dependent on activities like going out and having a good time. Whereas once some people in the friend group have families and other people, it's a little easier to have those friendships that are not requiring you to go out all the time. But I don't want to get too far off on a tangent. When somebody is dealing with this for the first time, how do you think you can step in and help? Because you're going to want to save all those friendships. You're going to want to prevent the hurt that you experienced, but you're also smart enough to know that you're not going to be able to do that. So, how do you deal with people when you start to hear those similar stories to the ones that you've had in your journey?
Hmm. I think, well, that's a hard one. I think there will be hurt. I think you'll be able to save some, but not all of them. And I think someone told me, and It doesn't sound the nicest, but it has helped me. Someone told me if they leave you when you're not doing well, they weren't good friends anyways. So that has helped me. It doesn't always help the hurt, but it's helped me with that. I think really communication is the biggest thing is get them on the phone, get them to come over to your house even if you have to lay on the couch. Like have a Zoom chat with your friends and be like, "Look, this is what's happening to me. I'm scared. This is what's happening to me. I don't know what tomorrow's going to look like." And tell them that your life is changing and it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you don't want to come. It's not your fault that you have to cancel last minute. And just tell them that this might happen. And then you can have a good conversation about it. And maybe the next day they'll call you up again and be like, "Hey, I have more questions." Maybe they won't. And that's just unfortunately how it works. But I think if they're a great enough friend and a good enough person, if you're really honest with them and have good communication, I think you'll be just fine. That's what I found anyways.
I definitely think it makes sense that the people who are there for more than just, going out and having a good time, which is fine. And there are people in your life who fill that function. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people if that's the only function that they fill in your life. But there come times where you need somebody who's maybe a little deeper. And there are going to be times, getting back to Sava Wellness, where maybe you haven't found those people yet. So having somebody like Sarah who has gone through those situations, and you're gonna find them. Like, I don't think you're gonna need Sarah for the rest of your life. Um, but to have those situations where you don't know who you can trust, or you're trying to navigate these situations. Maybe you just don't want to tell everybody everything. Maybe you don't want to feel like a burden to your friends because you're telling the same story, you're describing the same symptoms over and over and over again. And maybe you don't want to be viewed in that way yet by certain people. That's perfectly fine. And I think that's part of the service that Sarah provides at Sava Wellness. So, how has your experience of the world changed since your symptoms started? This is a question that you like to ask people when you interview them, but I think that your answer is going to be very interesting because you have a much greater hold on this. You've dealt with it for a long time. You've thought about it a lot. You've put in a lot of the research. So, how have you noticed that your world has changed?
Yeah, it has changed quite a lot. It has changed me personally. I find that I'm more resilient now, and I tend to listen more. I found that I've had to put in a lot more preparation to go out into society, if that means researching the walking trails beforehand so I know how far it is if there's benches, or if we're going to a restaurant with someone, researching to see if they have foods that match my restrictions. Or when we go on vacation, is it a vacation that's not too far by flight? Or is there, like emergency rooms close? Like sometimes you have to think about that. And I never had to think about that before, but like I can never go to some middle of the ocean island anymore, right? Because you just never know. I think I've realized that we're real people that want to live too.
So, how can somebody get a hold of you, Sarah? I think you have definitely laid out a lot here. So, how can somebody reach you at Sava Wellness?
My website is savawellness.ca, and that's where you can book with me and see all my socials. On Instagram and YouTube, I'm sava.wellness. And I'm also on Facebook at Sava Wellness. I'm most active on my Instagram, and my website's a great place to contact with me. So that's savawellness.ca.
And all this month, you have been doing an interview series. This is kind of reversing that, but you have been talking to people all this month. So why don't you tell people how they can get those interviews?
Yeah, this month we talked about is chronic disease, chronic illness, and disability Pride Month. So I've put together a set of interviews so that we can get a broader perspective on different chronic illnesses that aren't just mine. So those are posted on my website under the community tab, so you can look at them through there. I have posted links on all my socials, and the full videos are on YouTube as well as on my website.